The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And we are truly blessed, I mean really, to have Joseph P. Farrell with us. Dr. Farrell, as most all of you out there that listen are very much aware, he is a brilliantly gifted researcher, and we all know he is a prolific author. And the books he writes have extremely important meaning to all of us that are appreciative of his writing. And he has uncovered so many things. It's mind-boggling how Dr. Farrell can put all these things together. But we, at the Byte Show, have got a special page here for Dr. Farrell. Just go to the audio library, click on his name, and his special page opens with links and contact information, and you will see our series, Dirty Secrets, Nazi International, the Cosmic War series, and Joseph's new book, Roswell and the Reich, is now available. You can get this by contacting Adventures Unlimited Press, and on the guest page there's a notice about that under tonight's file, and get your copy while you can, because they are selling like hotcakes. Anyway, hello, Dr. Farrell.
Hi, GeorgeAnn. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. There's no snow here.
Well, there is here.
Yes, I know. I've been watching the Weather Channel. We're lucky not to live in Maryland or someplace like.
Boy, isn't that the truth? You know, I feel downright in the tropics here in South Dakota.
Same here. We've got rain, but thank goodness no snow yet.
Yeah, yet.
Well, you have written a book that is setting a lot of people's hair on fire, Joseph, that have had a lot of preconceived assumptions on this topic about Roswell, and we're all just dying to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, I thought what we'd do tonight, actually the book isn't even out yet, and this is what really amazes me. It's a couple of weeks, I think, when it's going to be scheduled to ship from the printer back to the publisher. But I've been kind of popping into Amazon from time to time and watching this thing, and it's unusual of all the books I've written in that it's selling even before it's released. It seems to be selling fairly well.
Very well, yes.
So yeah, maybe there's certain people that are a little nervous or something, either that or they're dying to prove the case that I've finally gone around the bend. Off my rocker, a few flies short of a Happy Meal.
Oh my goodness. Well, one thing for sure, Joseph, they want to get a first edition.
Well, the way it's looking now, I think probably this book might sell out of the first printing rather quickly. So,
yes. It's headed that way.
Yeah, it seems to be. We'll find out. But basically what I thought I'd do tonight is just kind of do a little bit of background survey, in this series, this new series that we're starting, and then in the coming interviews we'll get a little bit more into detail, and I'll probably try and tie together some things I know I've said before in the Cosmic War series, just kind of by way of introduction.
Yeah.
But I guess the place I want to start is, again, going back to my basic scenario that I think began to take place toward the end of World War II and then afterwards with what I'm calling the Nazi International. And That, just to kind of clarify again what I mean by the Nazi International, what I mean is that Nazism survived World War II and did so not simply as a bunch of isolated little enclaves in Latin America or the Middle East and so on and so forth, but as an organized extraterritorial state with an international extent and with a lot of money.
Oh, yes.
And with a very clear track record of continuing its wartime research projects independently of any of the Allied or Soviet powers that won World War II.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the initial backdrop. What I'm presupposing in Roswell and the Reich is, first of all, that this entity existed in 1947, and I think anyone who's read the books, especially Nazi International, would have to conclude that that is a fairly solid case, that this thing did indeed exist. That's the first part of the scenario. But the second part is that in this book, what I'm doing is, this is a different book than the others I've written, because the pace of writing is a little bit slower, and for very deliberate reason. What I do in the book is, when I set out to write this book, my publisher said, well, how long is it going to be? And I said, oh, maybe, 350 pages. Well, then I had to tell my publisher, no, it's now up to 400. And then he says, okay, fine. And so I said, no, now it's up to 450.
Yeah.
So the book is mushroomed up to about 520 pages. It's the longest book I've written thus far. So the pace is a bit slower. And the reason why is, in the first two parts of the book, what I do is I go through very meticulously, I hope, the major Roswell researchers, Stanton, Friedman, and Don Berliner, and Charles Berlitz, and William Moore, and Kevin Randall, and Don Schmidt on the extraterrestrial side of the interpretation of the incident. But I also go through two of the major skeptics concerning the incident, Karl Korff and Karl Flock, who, of course, argue the whole thing was just, a mistaken case of misidentification of a balloon. which, that one always had my head, kind of in a tailspin, because how in the name of sense do you take the only atomic bomb group in the United States Air Force at the time and have the intelligence officer of the same unit, who's handpicked for the job, go out and misidentify a common weather balloon or any other kind of balloon,
I know, that is just ludicrous.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's kind of right up there with the magic bullet theory,
Yeah. Oh.
So anyway, I go through all of the major Roswell researchers, and even some that are not so well known, in the first two parts of the book, and I go through them very, very slowly and meticulously, and get them on record from what their own books have said about certain things. And then I sit down and examine the Nazi interpretation of the incident, and let me explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
When I say that something Nazi probably crashed in New Mexico in July of 1947, what I am saying is this. I am saying that what crashed there is the product of a technology that was researched and developed in the Third Reich during World War II, and that continued to be researched by this independent post-war Nazi International after the war.
Yeah.
So in other words, what I'm saying, crashed, is not any part of an American black project that's being run by a bunch of the paperclip Nazis that we brought to this country. What I'm saying is what crashed represented and was immediately known to be from this post-war extraterritorial Nazi state that I'm calling the Nazi International.
That is the perfect description, an extraterritorial state.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, as I've said before, I think in the Cosmic War series of interviews, I don't even remember how long ago it was, if something, let's just put ourselves in the military's shoes for a moment.
Okay.
If we send the intelligence officer of the only atomic bomb group in the world at the time to investigate a field of debris, and this intelligence officer goes out. His name is Jesse Marcell, Sr., Major in the United States Army Air Force. He goes out and is now well known. He describes a bunch of very peculiar debris.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And as people know the story, the Army Air Force then put out a press release that was carried by various newspapers around the country on, I think it was July 7th or 8th. I'm not exactly certain of the date right off the top of my head. But this press release stated very clearly that the 509th Bomb Group there in Roswell, New Mexico, had recovered a crashed flying saucer. And that's all it said.
Yeah.
Okay, there was no mention of bodies. There was no mention of extraterrestrials. There, in fact, was no mention of where this thing originated at all. Okay?
Right.
So if we put ourselves in the shoes of the military and just assume now, for the sake of argument, in other words, we're assuming the case we have yet to prove, if we are assuming for the sake of argument that something Nazi crashes, and it is clearly not representative of any of the projects we have brought back to this country after the war,
right.
all right, then that is going to send the U.S. military into a tailspin of panic.
Oh, yes.
Because what it means is that somehow, somewhere out there, somewhere in the world, there is an organized, efficient Nazi Party organization that is still capable of producing these things. It has the money to continue to develop them, and it can fly them around American airspace with impunity.
Yeah.
Okay? So, yeah, the United States military is going to panic. So the way I'm looking at this in the first two parts of the book is I'm telling the Roswell story as the Roswell researchers themselves have told it. Okay?
Okay.
And I'm subjecting the whole telling of the story to a very thorough review. In other words, I'm getting them on record and citing them in their own words.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing I want to point out, and this is kind of also by way of introduction to what we'll be doing in this series of talks, I guess, is if you look at the Roswell story, it's really told in several, I call them articulations in the book. Okay? They're told, in other words, in several different layers. Now, the very first layer, I've already mentioned what it is, namely that the United States Army Air Force let out a press release that they had recovered a crashed flying saucer, period.
Yeah.
We don't know any more about it than that.
Right.
Okay? We're not told the origin. We're not told what it looks like. We're not even told anything about the actual debris itself. That's all we're told.
Yes.
Then, mere hours later, literally within the same 24-hour period, the U.S. Army Air Force completely reverses itself in another press conference held in Fort Worth, Texas, where Brigadier General Roger Ramey, who is the commanding general officer of the 509th Bomb Group because it's part of the 8th Air Force, well, Brigadier General Roger Ramey gives a press release in which he says that basically the intelligence officer of the only atomic bomb group in the United States Air Force had retrieved and misidentified the debris of a crashed weather balloon. Okay?
Oh, gee. Yeah. I mean, does this make us have confidence in the military?
Well, exactly. Does this make us have confidence in the government?
Exactly.
And any of its explanations? Because now look what we have. This is just the first articulation of the story. And in that first articulation of the story, whatever the common elements are, they reduce to this: that the U.S. Army Air Force went out and found something in a field and recovered it. So in other words, the basic core of the Roswell story is that the United States Army Air Force recovered a technology.
Yes.
All right? Now, look at what they've done. On the very same day, they have given you two poles, two diametrically opposed poles, by which you are to interpret this event. On the one hand, they're telling you, oh yeah, we got a crashed and recovered flying saucer here. And on the other hand, they're telling you, oh no, it was just a plain old balloon.
Yeah.
So in other words, you are driven by the Army itself initially into two different modes of interpretation. Either this is something very extraordinary or very mundane and ordinary.
Right.
Now, that I want everybody to bear in mind, because this is a crucial, crucial point in the development of the story. Because you'll discover, when you read all the Roswell researchers since that original articulation, be they proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis or proponents of some sort of, crashed balloon or other technology that was purely mundane, it is always the case that the story has been spun to fit one of those two alternatives.
Yes.
Down to this day.
Yes.
Okay? So I call this little opposition of interpretations, I call it the Roswell dialectic. Because inevitably, what it is forcing you to do is to ignore an extraordinary but terrestrial explanation for what happened, all right? And that's where I think this Nazi scenario comes in. Because if you look at what I'm saying, if it is something Nazi that crashes in New Mexico, and if it is representative of a post-war extraterritorial Nazi state, all right?
Yes.
If that is the case, then what crashes is extraordinary not only by dint of the technology, but it is extraordinary by dint of its political origin and implications.
Oh, yes.
So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, in other words, the Army Air Force has to spin it so that people will not look at that possibility. And they haven't been looking at that possibility ever since July of 1947. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, that's just kind of the first articulation. Now, the second articulation of the story is really something that takes place, I want to say about 23 years later, maybe 33 actually, I may be off on my figures, because the researchers Charles Berlitz and William Moore, with the famous ufologist Stanton Friedman helping them as kind of a background researcher, they published a book, I think it was in 1980, they published a book called The Roswell Incident. And this is where, for the first time, the story is revitalized after laying dormant since 1947. Yeah. And it's revitalized in two ways. The first is that Mr. Friedman contacted Major Marcell, the actual intelligence officer at that base at that time, and interviewed him at great length. He and Bill Moore both did, and interviewed Major Marcell at great length. And it's from that interview that you begin to have the first details of what happened leaked out to the public. And it's in that interview that Major Marcell first outlined all of the very peculiar, very strange properties of this recovered debris. All right?
Yes.
But the other thing that happens in this book is that the event begins to be spun and interpreted, and I use the word spun in a very deliberate and intentional sense, because what also happens is you begin to have the first appearance of what I call the endless parade of Roswell extraterrestrial witnesses. In other words, people coming forward and claiming that they saw unusual bodies that were recovered with the various crash sites associated with the incident. Okay? So it's this book, The Roswell Incident by Berlitz and Moore, that begins the whole emergence of Roswell into the popular culture as the crash and recovery of an extraterrestrial, genuine, bona fide spaceship. Yeah. All right? So that's what I call the second articulation. That's really kind of the emergence of the Roswell story. Now, one of the things that happens in their book is they also begin to, how do I want to put it? they begin to mention and then dismiss the Nazi scenario, and this is what I find very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, it's already it's already floating out there. Well, could this have been a crashed V2? Could it have been the crash of some black project that was being conducted in the United States and for the United States by a bunch of these paperclip Nazi scientists?
Yeah.
Well, the argument that they present against that idea is actually very, very sound, because what they say is that it could not possibly have been something from an American black project being run by a bunch of Nazis that we brought over here, for the very simple reason that if it had been one of these things, it is highly unlikely, first of all, that we would have been flying it around during a thunderstorm in New Mexico, which is how this all began, if you read the story. And, of course, I'll fill in the details in future interviews, but I'm just kind of outlining everything tonight.
Okay.
But we would be highly unlikely to be flying something around at night in a thunderstorm over the deserts of New Mexico as part of a black project. I mean, this is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
And secondly, even if we were, and all of a sudden the thing crashes and goes missing, say, 3 or 4 days earlier, if not 2 weeks, the timeline varies depending on who you talk to, what witness you talk to in this story. But if it had gone missing at any point previous to that, then you betcha the U.S. military would have been out looking for it much, much earlier.
Yeah.
But instead, what happened was you had this rancher northwest of Roswell by the name of Mac Brazel that brought a bunch of this stuff into town. In other words, the military wasn't looking for this at all until it was brought to the military's attention.
Very interesting point.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, in other words, it cannot be. We can rule out an American origin for whatever it was that crashed there. All right?
Because when they lose something that falls out of the sky, they are right there.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So, their argument here is very sound. But I find it's rather interesting that already, before anyone has even begun to think about Roswell in the popular consciousness, already we have to take certain steps to make sure people don't look too close at Nazis. You follow me? So anyway, then we have, for want of a better expression, what I call the third articulation, and I'm kind of summarizing what's going on here, but the third articulation is the publication of a very significant book. It's probably with Berlitz and Moore's book, The Roswell Incident. This other book is called Crash at Corona, and these two books, the Berlitz-Moore book and then this book, Crash at Corona, which is by Don Berliner and of course, Stanton Friedman.
Yeah. This
is the book that really, really does break out the Roswell story into the popular consciousness. Because, whatever one says of these gentlemen, one cannot deny the fact that these two are extremely good researchers.
Yeah.
Mr. Friedman has for years footed the major part of his research into this incident out of his own pocket. He's taken the time to go out and interview people and dig up witnesses. He's taken the time to go to the National Archives and dig up documents and research.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the book, really, that breaks the Roswell story out into the open and puts it more or less on a solid foundation, okay? And it's a very, very crucial book to understand the Roswell incident story because of that fact. But again, in this third articulation, as I'm calling it, by Berliner and Friedman, what you see happening in the story is you find that the chronological sequence of events is tightened down. You have further witnesses to the presence of bodies uncovered, okay? And the chief witness here, in this respect, is a very significant name. We're going to be spending a lot of time with him over the next few interviews. His name is Glenn Dennis. He was a young mortician, a kind of an intern at the mortuary there in Roswell at the time. And as such, he had access to the base. And we'll learn a little bit later about what his story is. But he claims that a nurse friend of his actually saw and then later drew some of the physiological features of these alleged recovered extraterrestrials. Okay?
Yes.
So in other words, in Berliner and Friedman's third articulation of the story, you have two things going on, and it's very subtle to pay attention to what is going on now. You have the original story, which is about the recovery of a technology and some extraordinary debris, okay? But the other thing that you have, beginning slowly to take over center stage in the story, is the idea that there were recovered extraterrestrials themselves. And from this point on in the Roswell story, from that point on, the emphasis of the story changes from debris to bodies.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So their work is particularly important. They also uncover a few other witnesses, and again, we'll be getting to those people in a moment. But again, what's very interesting to me is, and I even cite this in Roswell and the Reich, is that Berliner and Friedman go out of their way to disprove the Nazi scenario. And they do it in a very interesting way. They say it couldn't be the crash of a V-2, and it couldn't be the crash of any sort of German flying wing or anything like that.
Yeah.
Because all of those projects were known and all the parts and so on would have been numbered and very evident to whoever it was that went out there and recovered that debris. That's true.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that they say is, well, it couldn't represent any sort of continuation of the so-called Foo Fighter technology from World War II. And then they say a very interesting thing, and this is quite literally where I hang a lot of the case, not all of it by any means. But their statement is so overwhelming and so sweeping and so patently untrue. They say that at no time, nowhere, did any Foo Fighter during World War II ever show the slightest hostile action against Allied aircraft.
Oh.
Wrong.
You're right. You're right.
Wrong.
Yeah.
So, what they've essentially done is they've tried to say that anybody that argues for the Nazi scenario of Roswell can only be arguing in terms of V-2s, flying wings, or Foo Fighters, as if that was all the technology that the Nazis had available to them.
Oh, my.
You see, they've in a certain sense, in my opinion, they've kind of painted themselves into a corner.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing that has emerged from this Bell story that I've been following along with Nick Cook and Igor Vitkovsky is that neither the Allies nor the Soviet Union ever had a complete and full picture of exactly everything the Nazis were up to. The fact that we have a more or less complete picture now is simply due to the fact that the Iron Curtain collapsed and Germany was reunified, and now all of a sudden we're able to put together all of these pieces. So, yeah, we can't assume that what Berliner and Friedman are saying was the extent of Nazi technology. We cannot assume that that's all of it.
Right.
Okay? As Friedman says, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Good point. Yeah.
I turn his words right back on him.
Yes. Exactly.
So anyway, that's the third articulation. Then it gets very interesting because there is yet a fourth articulation of this idea that we recovered a crashed extraterrestrial craft and bodies. And that's the version of the incident that was given out by Dr. Kevin Randall and then his then research associate, Don Schmidt. And, of course, they later broke up because, of course, Randall discovered that Schmidt had been playing kind of fast and loose with some facts.
Oh boy.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
But anyway, what happens in their version of the scenario, and again we'll get into the details, is they uncover more witnesses to the bodies, all right?
Yeah.
And they revise the whole timeline that had been carefully worked out in the second and third articulations by Friedman and Berliner and Berlitz and more. They take that whole timeline and basically pull it apart and stitch it back together in a new way.
Yeah.
But essentially, what they do is they boil it all back down again to a rehash that what we recovered were primarily bodies. And it's very interesting now to see what happens in their hands, because the methodological assumptions of the people that want to interpret Roswell as an extraterrestrial incident, the methodological assumptions are spelled out now very clearly by Randall and Schmidt, and let me tell you how.
Okay.
What they say is that even though the debris and the details about the debris that are recounted are certainly extraordinary, okay? Those details are not extraordinary enough to compel to the conclusion that what crashed was extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
That compulsion can only come from the recovery of bodies.
Yeah.
And so and they're right, of course, because if you're going to argue that it is extraterrestrial, the bodies cinch the case.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're going to be doing now, as you can kind of tell by now, there are really two different data sets in the Roswell story that will tell you how to interpret it. On the one hand, you've got the debris and all of the detailed descriptions of it, and on the other hand, you've got the bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now let's go back and put together what we have then. We've got two data sets, bodies and debris, and the debris, by their own admission, does not compel to extraterrestrial, and the bodies do, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And then underneath that, in the first articulation of the story, what do we have? We have the recovery only of a flying saucer, in other words, debris,
yeah,
or a weather balloon. Okay?
Yes.
So, in other words, we not only have two data sets, but we've got a dialectical opposition in which we are supposed to interpret those two data sets. Okay, with me?
Yes.
Now, there is basically one more little problem, and I'm going to mention, and we'll get into details. I guess I think we'll probably get into a lot more details once this series continues.
Yeah, and when you say little problem, I'm ready for this gigantic thing.
Well, yeah, you know what the gigantic thing is because I've already discussed it with you.
Yes.
There's lots of gigantic little problems.
Yeah.
with this whole thing.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but again, we have this basic data set of things that we've got to interpret.
Yes.
All right, now, that's the first four articulations. Now, please note something here, folks. It took approximately, I'd say 23 to 30 years from 1947 to the emergence or re-emergence of the Roswell story in the popular consciousness. It took that amount of time to produce witnesses for the bodies. Okay? The original story, once again, was simply about the recovery of debris.
Yes.
And it was either a flying saucer, let's remember, or a weather balloon.
I know. Oh.
Now, folks, if that doesn't tell you there is spin control taking place from the outset, I don't know what will. I don't know what will. In my opinion, the way I put it in the book, GeorgeAnn,
yes,
you have four government explanations, four official government explanations of what happened in Roswell. The first one was, it's a flying saucer. The second one was, it's a weather balloon. And then the third one was, you had a bunch of people coming out at various points in between the second and the fourth explanation saying, it was some sort of Japanese balloon.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the final version of the balloon theory that we were feted to was this whole nutty, loony, mogul balloon idea, that the U.S. Air Force came out with in the 1990s, okay?
Yeah.
Well, if you look at what the government is telling us, to me, the idea, once again, that the only atomic bomb group in the world at the time would have its intelligence officer, who's handpicked for the job, go out to a debris field and misidentify the elements of a common weather balloon or any other kind of balloon. So in other words, what it looks to me is that the government's official explanations are designed, please hear me now, are designed to maintain the longevity of its first explanation, namely that it had retrieved something extraterrestrial. It had retrieved a flying saucer.
Well, Joseph, did they maybe kick it around a little bit and say, oh my gosh, this could be very useful to us?
Oh yes,
as part of an agenda.
Oh yes, there's a well-known. I don't even want to use the word ufologist of this man.
Okay.
Because he's not really a ufologist. What he is he's a documents researcher. Okay. And his name is Richard Dolan. All right. He has written 2 volumes called UFOs and the National Security State, and really all they are is a study of the government's reaction to the UFO phenomenon. He's not even really concerned whether they're extraterrestrial or not. He's not concerned with any of that. He's simply concerned with showing what the government's response to it was.
Oh, okay.
Okay? Yeah. Now, one of the things that he points out, I believe in the first volume of this book, is that it appears that some elements in the government did, in fact, decide to use the UFO phenomenon in precisely this way, as a means to pull off some sort of agenda or psychological operation, to kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
Yes.
So, yeah. And particularly, I think this is the case with the Roswell incident. I think, we've had this thing happen to us, and obviously we know where it's coming from. We might as well play it as much to our advantage as we can while we're trying to figure out where it's coming from and what to do about it. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, yeah, I think you have a strong element of that. But, again, in my opinion, it looks to me as if the last 3 official government explanations are deliberately designed to guarantee the life of the first one.
Yeah, okay.
You follow me?
That makes sense.
Yeah,
yes.
Well, the last 3 explanations are just so nutty.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're getting to that part of the story because the 5th articulation of the Roswell incident are what I call the skeptics.
Yeah.
Okay? The people that come forward with very sophisticated, let's give them due credit here, with very sophisticated arguments, that this was all some sort of top-secret mogul balloon project that crashed. Okay? Well, the problem there is, as I will be outlining in the future interviews, the problem there is that while that explanation accounts for some of the Roswell debris,
right,
it does not account for all of that debris.
Right.
Okay? And that's just pure and simple what invalidates the whole explanation. But there's another big whopper that invalidates the Air Force's investigation. I went out and bought a copy of it, and I was dumbfounded that there are people that still defend this thing. Because if you read the witnesses that the Air Force cites, the very witnesses that claim to have seen bodies, okay? Well, if you examine the Roswell literature carefully, those witnesses that the Air Force cites have now all but been abandoned by the very Roswell ufology community that produced them in the first place.
Oh, my goodness.
And the reason why that community has abandoned them is that those very researchers have shown that these are no longer credible witnesses.
Yeah. Oh, my.
So, in other words, you have the ufology community, which is trying to argue the ET hypothesis, has gone out and done their own homework, let's give them due credit here, has gone out and done their own homework and proven that many of the witnesses that they relied on to establish the original story of a crashed extraterrestrial craft are no longer credible.
Oh, wow.
And they did this at the time that the Air Force was basing its report on the testimony of the very same witnesses, claiming, oh no, they just saw crash test dummies.
Could those witnesses have been intimidated to say what they said?
You mean about E.T.?
Yeah.
We'll get to that later.
Oh my goodness.
You're not going to believe what the short answer, GeorgeAnn, is yes.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
Yeah, there is one primary Roswell witness in particular.
Yeah.
That it is, if you just sit down and read the Roswell researchers themselves carefully, it's like they themselves can't see what they're putting in their own books.
Wow.
Because in this one witness's case, it's very clear that he's saying all of this extraterrestrial stuff under duress. Follow me?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in other words, getting back to the Air Force thing, we've got the U.S. Air Force saying that, well, the witnesses saw crash test dummies, and the witnesses it's relying on are witnesses that the ET Roswell community has already gone out of its way and done copious research to show that their stories are simply no longer credible.
Wow. Yeah.
So in other words, we are back to square one, folks.
Boy, this is a real Rube Goldberg.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, that is about the only way to describe it.
Wow.
I mean, you look at this story, and it really is like one of those wild contraptions.
Yes.
Oh,
my gosh.
And it has so many, it has so much duct tape and patchwork done onto it, it's no longer even the same story.
I'm so disappointed, Joseph. They told us that we got Velcro from these people that crashed.
Well, let's stop and look at it, GeorgeAnn. I mean, really, here, let's just stop and think.
Yes.
The basic core of the Roswell story is that you have an extraterrestrial craft that was hit by a lightning strike during a thunderstorm sometime around July 4th of 1947 flying over New Mexico, and it crashed. That's the basic core story.
Right.
So you're telling me that advanced extraterrestrials flew all the way here from somewhere?
Yeah, through all the space debris.
Through all the space debris and stuff, and then got hit by lightning?
Yeah.
And that made them crash?
That's kind of silly.
Yeah, well, duh.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
It's when you just stop and put all this together and use a little thought, on the one hand, it's clear that the military did panic. They've gone through no less than 4 articulations of the story of their own, notwithstanding the Roswell people, the independent researchers. They've gone through no less than 4 articulations, and no one articulation is the same as the other, So, they can't even get their own story straight. So, in other words, something had them panicked back in 1947, and they still want to keep it covered up.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
All right. So, then we have, I go through the alien autopsy, that whole farce and hoax that went on back in the 1990s on Fox television and stuff. I did that simply for completeness.
Yes.
To be honest with you, I never placed any credibility in that whole thing at all. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I show in the book, that whole film, that whole so-called alien autopsy thing was a complete hoax.
Yeah.
And I give my reasons why, and we'll get into that eventually. And then finally, the last articulation of the Roswell story was, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, and the day after Roswell.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to say a few words about him, because many in the Roswell research community, both believer and skeptic, dismiss that book Okay?
Mm-hmm.
I do too, but for very different reasons. And I don't dismiss it entirely either. Because what's really, really peculiar to me is that Corso is someone with a U.S. Army intelligence background.
Yeah.
Okay? And he makes two very significant things, two kinds of statements. And this is really the thing that if you read his book carefully, sticks out like a sore thumb over and over and over again. And that is, number one, he says, yes, the U.S. Army Air Force retrieved a crashed extraterrestrial craft. And we took that technology, back-engineered it, and seeded it into American industry, okay?
Yes.
But he does something that no one else did before him, and he lists specifically the technologies that he claims were recovered at Roswell as being extraterrestrial.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those technologies are things like lasers, fiber optics, integrated circuitry, the transistors, infrared night vision, and, so on and so forth, okay? In other words, he's very specific in what he's claiming is extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
All right? Now, the other thing that he says, and in fact, I even quote this. This is one of my favorite quotations in my presentations I do at conferences, and it's a favorite quotation of mine in this book. Because he'll say very boldly, number one, the U.S. Army, in the absence of evidence, had to conclude that what it had recovered was an extraterrestrial. But then, GeorgeAnn, in the very next sentence, he says, incidentally, because the technology looked so similar to the technology we'd seen evidenced by the Nazis, this caused the Army to assume that whoever crashed there had hostile intentions. Okay?
Oh, yes.
Now,
yes.
This is what I think people have missed in Corso, because every time you have him blathering on and on about all this advanced extraterrestrial technology, who else is he talking about? He's talking about Nazis.
Wow.
So in other words, it's a very self-contradictory book.
Yes, yes.
Okay? It's as if he is the first one that's really coming out and kind of giving you a poke in the ribs with his elbow and saying, okay, look a little closer here too, folks.
Yeah.
Okay? So I do talk about Lieutenant Colonel Corso in the book. All right? And what I've just surveyed now is basically all of part one of the book. Okay? Part two of the book is where I survey what I call the Magic 12 Documents hoax, and listeners to the Cosmic War series and readers of my books will know that I subject some of those Magic 12 documents to an examination of what they might indicate concerning the technological origins. Now, please understand, folks, the kind of argument I was making in those books is that I was arguing on the basis of the internal evidence of the documents themselves and what they said. I was not arguing for or against their authenticity. Follow me?
Yes.
In this book, I'm expanding that argument because I myself have never believed that any of those documents are 100% plain, straight, legitimate. In other words, I believe at worst they're a hoax. And at best, they are deliberate disinformation that is being put out by somebody on the inside that knows an awful lot.
Yeah.
Okay? So basically in part two of the book, I go over Friedman's case for the authenticity of some of those Magic 12 documents, and then over Randall's case against the authenticity of the very same documents. All right?
Yes.
And the reason I'm stressing that is because, again, as we're going to see in some of the upcoming interviews. What Friedman and Randall also do as they're making their respective cases is they bring out other details of interpretation that are really very interesting once you see what they are. Okay?
Oh, Joseph.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, this may be the reason that this book is already selling. You know,
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I have the feeling, you know, that it might detonate over people's heads like a thunderclap. I think it's going to make certain people within a certain community very uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, this agenda about, you know, the space aliens are, you know, they've been pushing that
right.
in a lot of different circles.
Right.
And not just the UFO community.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I've said it many times that I am not philosophically opposed to the existence of extraterrestrials. I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Yeah.
My problem is particularly since the Roswell story reemerged, is that you have this tendency within ufology circles to write off any extraordinary human advance of technology as being the product of a crashed and recovered extraterrestrial device.
Yeah.
I mean, my word, that even happened to me at Laughlin. A well-known ufologist, exopolitician, you know, kind of cornered me at my booth and was trying to argue that, well, couldn't the Nazis have come up with all this advanced technology because there was that crash and recovery of a craft in the Black Forest in 1933. Well, you know, my problem, folks, is, number one, if E.T. keeps crashing stuff on this planet at this rate,
yes,
eventually we're going to have to start crashing stuff on E.T.'s world so he can catch back up with us.
Yeah, you know, good point. Oh, beautifully said.
Yeah, you know, it's,
oh my goodness.
Folks, as an explanation, this is a non-starter because what it's doing is it's making you avoid looking for possible terrestrial explanations.
That's right.
Okay? And I always start there. And I have to be honest, I got rather mad with this person who was telling me this because he hadn't even bothered to read my books.
Yeah.
And I simply told him, I said, you know, so-and-so, here's the problem with your take. Number one, that whole story has never been validated. And, you know, it's taken 60 years for it to come out. My word, Roswell only took 30.
Oh, gee. Yeah.
You know.
Oh.
So I just can't place much credence in that line of approach. It irritates me. It makes me mad.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I've gone out of my way to try and document a reasonable speculative case for what I think the basis behind this Nazi technology was.
Yes.
And I have nowhere ever had to invoke E.T. to do it.
Yeah.
These were just plain ordinary, you know, good old-fashioned homegrown krauts, you know, publishing their papers in their physics journals.
Yeah.
That's basically
and
all
look
it was.
Isn't it interesting that the head of Germany is a physicist?
You know, oh yeah, well, yeah.
I mean,
given everything that's going on nowadays.
Yeah. I don't dismiss that one.
Yeah, exactly. You know, what do we call her? Herr Professor Dr. Kanzlerin. You know?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh.
She's probably got more titles than the Queen of England by now.
Probably. Yes. Yes.
But anyway, you know, the first woman chancellor of Germany just also happens to be a physicist. You know.
Yeah.
This I don't think is accidental.
No, it can't be.
No, of course not.
Oh my goodness.
Well, anyway, in the third part of the book, let me just very quickly go through what I'm doing in the third part. It's part 3 where I actually lay out the positive case for the Nazi scenario. And I'm not going to mention in this talk what I think the big problem with Roswell research is. All I will tell people to do is look carefully at the backgrounds of the major researchers involved in it.
Okay.
Okay? And then we'll talk about that on down the line in a couple of weeks or so when the book's actually out and people have a chance to get their feet wet.
Yeah.
But anyway, what I do in Part 3 is I concentrate on the two basic data sets. In other words, the bodies and the debris.
Yes.
Okay? And there's a third data set that I have hinted at in the other two parts of the book, and that's documents. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And that's where... I know why you say that, because that is where the plot thickens, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There are two documents in particular that are of known, indisputable authenticity that the Roswell research community, both ET believer and skeptic, have cited with respect to the Roswell incident. And I go through those documents in detail with a fine-tooth comb, and we're going to go through them in this series of talks on Roswell.
Oh, boy.
Because when you get done going through them and really paying attention to them, the first thing I do is I don't use the fake version that the ET believers use.
Good point.
Yeah, that's a good step. That's helpful.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And when you compare the fake version to the original version, I'll just summarize it now. The fake version is going out of its way to misdirect attention away from what the original non-faked version is telling you where this technology originated. And guess where the original non-faked version tells you it came from? Nazis. Bingo.
Yes.
Bingo. In the fake version, they add a little sentence onto that part of the document that says, but there are some people that were of the opinion it might be extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
And so then you can go through the fake version of the document line by line, as I do in the book, and compare to the original and see the little modifications in the document that had to be made in order to make the document make any sense.
Wow.
And even with those modifications, it still doesn't make sense.
Oh, my goodness. Oh.
So yeah, this is a huge book. You know, it's a slower paced book, but I go through the details with a fine-toothed comb for a reason. But anyway, when you get done with these two documents, I think it's fairly clear that the U.S. Air Force, if you read them objectively, knows where this stuff is coming from. They are panicked spitless because they realize the Soviet Union couldn't possibly have produced anything like this. And there's only one other place on the planet that did, and they even spell it out for you.
Oh, my.
And that's Nazis.
Wow.
So in other words, if you read the documents carefully, they are very subtly pointing to the possibility that what the U.S. Air Force is dealing with in 1947, 2 years after the supposed end of World War II, are a bunch of Nazis flying around in this stuff over our airspace with impunity.
Yes, protect us, the government. They can't. Really.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo.
Oh. Yeah.
Remember what I said about Mr. Bormann? You're dealing with Dick Cheney without the warmth and charm?
Yeah. Very good description. Whoa.
Well, that's exactly, I think, the realization that they came to. Now, in that third part of the book, I go through the whole Foo Fighter argument of Berliner and Friedman and pull out certain cases from the record of those cases during World War II that show clearly, number one, a German origin for them, and number two, hostile action on their part against Allied aircraft.
Right.
So you cannot say that at no time did these show any signs of being even mildly unfriendly, I think was Berliner and Friedman's words. They certainly did show signs of being more than just mildly unfriendly.
Yeah.
And incidentally, one of the generals that's collecting intelligence on all of this activity during World War II is General Nathan Twining. Now, Roswell people will know that name because it's General Nathan Twining that was supposedly, and really was, in New Mexico in 1947 in the immediate aftermath of the Roswell incident. And it's the same General Twining who wrote one of these documents that I referred to just a few minutes before. And it's the same General Twining who is the chief of the Air Materials Command at Wright Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, which is headquarters to a bunch of paperclip Nazis.
Wow.
Okay?
Oh.
So, you know, you can only close the Roswell circle if you look at World War II.
Yeah. This is breathtaking, Joseph.
Oh, I'm just scratching the surface. I'm just scratching the surface.
You know, I've got to tell a story on myself to the listeners.
Oh, sure.
You remember?
I think I know what this story is.
No, you remember what our Cosmic War series.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I were talking one time. We were getting ready for a show.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, well, it's in my book. Haven't you read it? And I said, Joseph, I've never gotten a copy of your book. And you just roared. You said, how could we? You know?
That's true.
I mean, I just kind of winged through.
Yeah, you winged through that whole series, and I have to doff my hat because you did. And well, we could be honest with people here. The book isn't even out yet, so she hasn't had a chance to read it, folks.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, well, I saw to it, folks, that she got a copy of the Cosmic War, so she's actually reading it.
Yes, I am, and we're going to do more
Cosmic War.
Yeah, there's a lot more in there. I have found questions to ask you.
Oh, yes, I'm sure that, the devil's in the details.
Oh, yes, it is. Joseph, I just must ask, because it's one of my favorite subjects.
Uh-huh.
In this new book,
mm-hmm.
and this material,
mm-hmm.
Does any of this have something to do with templates?
Yes.
It does.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
My.
Yes, it does.
Oh, my.
Because it's all the same physics. This is. You've had Michael Schratt.
Yes.
On your show, and he has talked in his presentations about the crucial point, the holy grail of aerodynamics.
Yeah.
Which is to be able to suction the boundary layer off of a lifting body.
Yeah.
Okay, the boundary layer is that little thin layer of air, a molecule or two thick, that covers an aircraft's wing. Okay?
Yeah.
And it stays more or less stationary.
Yeah.
As the aircraft moves faster, that boundary layer is pushed back along the wing. And when you reach supersonic speeds, that boundary layer is actually what is causing the sonic boom. Okay?
Yeah.
So the holy grail of aerodynamics has always been to figure out some way to suction the boundary layer and reduce drag and improve the flight efficiency performance of the aircraft that you're dealing with. Okay?
Yes.
Well, the boundary layer suctioning problem was researched almost nonstop by Great Britain, the United States, and Nazi Germany prior to the war. But the Germans, of course, being Germans, figured out a lot of interesting ways to do this.
Yes.
And, to me, what it appears now, to me, after having finished this book, is that they may have been successful in some of this radical technology to a certain extent to suction the boundary layer.
Like putting those little itty-bitty teeny-weeny
holes. Yes, in metal.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to mention that, but since you mention it, what the Germans did was they invented an alloy called Luftschwamm, which means aerial sponge. And it's a heavily sinterized metal, which means that it has micropores in the metal, tiny little holes that aren't visible to the naked eye. That with proper suctioning equipment on the inside of this thing, it literally vacuums the boundary layer right off the wing.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is what they were really doing, and the reason that is so significant, GeorgeAnn, is that Major Marcell, the intelligence officer at the 509th Atomic Bomb Group in Roswell, describes some of the debris as being porous enough that you could blow through.
Oh.
Okay?
Oh.
Now, hold on, folks.
Yes.
What material in use in a balloon would be porous so that you could blow through.
Nothing.
That would kind of seem to defeat the purpose of a balloon.
No fooling.
Uh-huh.
You crash.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a very good balloon.
No.
No. So if you connect that one data point to what the Nazis were doing, you have one clear connection between the Roswell debris and what the Nazis were doing. And there are many, many others, but my point is if you look at the debris in detail, and I'll tell you something, folks, right now, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I go through each little point of the Roswell debris and the descriptions of it from the hieroglyphics on down, and point out similar antecedent technologies, including the memory metal characteristics, folks, that were known to the Germans as early as 1932.
Oh, my goodness. Oh.
And when I cannot find a Nazi antecedent, I tell you.
Yes.
Okay? And that only happened, friends, in one case. But in every other case of that Roswell debris, I have been able to rationalize it, I think, on a plausible terrestrial basis and on the basis of things that would have been known to the Germans in that time frame.
Oh. Well, they even had extraordinary microscopes very early. Yeah.
In fact, I have a picture of one of those microscopes, a scanning electron microscope that was in use inside of the Third Reich before World War II.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was built by our good old friends again at the AEG company. Remember them?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gee. Oh.
So, you know.
Oh, Joseph.
Yeah,
the research you've put into this is just, it is mind-boggling. Oh, wow.
Well, you know, I have to doff my hat to another Roswell researcher that crawled courageously way out there back in 2003 with a book that he published in that year. The researcher's name is probably well known to many of you that are familiar with the Roswell story, and his name is Nick Redfern. And the book is called Body Snatchers in the Desert.
Oh.
And I spend a whole chapter in the last part of the book reviewing that book because Redfern is really, to give him his due, the first one that has seen the Nazi angle to Roswell and seen it clearly.
Yes.
And secondly, he has done absolute yeoman's work in showing the fact that all of the body descriptions of the so-called witnesses to the bodies are also rationalizable on wholly terrestrial lines. Now, you need not buy or accept the scenario that he's proposing in his book in order to see the book's importance. The book's importance is that one fact alone, that it is no longer possible simply to point to the bodies and say, oh, looky, extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
Because he goes over that with a fine-toothed comb, and at the end of it, in my opinion, that whole line is exploded.
Yeah.
So what remains as the extraordinary factor in the Roswell incident is what it started out to be, and that's the debris.
Yeah.
And the origin of that debris. And I'll tie it up with this observation.
Okay.
Everyone has their favorite Roswell witness. Okay?
Sure.
Well, I didn't uncover this witness. Someone else did. But the someone else isn't even a Roswell researcher. But this witness told a very different story about Roswell. And as I point out in the book, what this witness pointed out was that when he put the pieces of the debris together, what he saw when he did so that made him swallow and realize he'd better get the HE double toothpicks right out of there before the military arrived, was he saw the German Balkenkreuz. which was, that straight-armed cross that the German aircraft were painted with.
Yes.
So, if that witness, and please underscore that word, if that witness is credible, if we can accept the second-hand dead man's testimony, and that, incidentally, is the kind of testimony you're dealing with predominantly with all of the witnesses to the bodies.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how they're dead?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would never be accepted in a court of law. But let's say you allow it. Then why can't you allow this one?
Right.
Okay?
Right.
But that man's testimony just kind of underscores for me why this story is so significant, because I think you can make the case that this could have been something Nazi without this witness at all. In fact, I don't rely on him. I just toss him in there, for good measure. Oh, by the way, this fellow's out here and he said these things.
Yeah.
But the reality of it, to me, GeorgeAnn, is that the debris is rationalizable terrestrial on the basis of technologies that were known to the Germans. The documents that the ufologists themselves are citing that are legitimate, and if cited in their legitimate versions, point the finger clearly to Nazi Germany.
Yes.
And if you look at, finally, the bodies themselves are no longer in their details compelling to the idea that it's extraterrestrial. So that leaves us with the explanation, just to kind of sum up the outline of the case.
Mm-hmm.
We are somewhere in between the two poles that the U.S. military has tried to control the interpretation of the incident. Because on the one hand, the military wanted you to think either it was extraordinary and ipso facto extraterrestrial, or it was ordinary and ipso facto mundane and terrestrial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But, as I point out in the book, there's no logical argument that leads from extraordinary to the conclusion that it has to be extraterrestrial. And there's no logical argument that leads from it having been terrestrial to it having been mundane and ordinary. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what I'm ending up with is, yes, it's terrestrial, but no, it is not ordinary. It is extraordinary, both by dint of the technology and by dint of the origin of that technology in that time and in that place.
Well, Joseph, given the brilliance of the German mind,
mm-hmm.
isn't it possible? I know Russia's played with this, Japan's
mm-hmm.
played with it, China's playing with it,
mm-hmm.
and so are we,
mm-hmm.
and not just recently.
Right.
But isn't it possible that they could have designed, if you will, in a lab, some creature that...
Oh, sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But I don't even think you have to go there. My point is that the bodies are, let's look again at what the bodies are, that part of the story.
Okay.
They are added to the story much later than the original articulation.
Yeah.
The people adding that detail are second-hand dead man testimony. Okay?
Yeah.
In other words, it's people telling you what a bunch of dead people told them. Okay? It's the ultimate lawyer's nightmare.
Yeah.
Inadmissible in a court of law.
Right.
All right? But accepting that testimony for the sake of argument, when you look at the details overwhelmingly described for the bodies of those witnesses, the details themselves are not sufficiently compelling to the idea that, number one, they're extraterrestrial, or number two, even genetically modified or altered or created beings.
Okay.
You simply don't need that level of detail. The real heart of the Roswell story was always and originally the debris.
Yes.
And what they have done is to create, in my opinion, what they have done is to create a cycle of spin and interpretation to keep people from focusing on the debris too closely.
Uh-huh.
And the way you do that is you either make the debris wholly mundane by making it a balloon, or you make it something so extraordinary by adding extraterrestrial bodies that you don't look too closely at it, because if you do look too closely at it, you'll discover that it's a terrestrial technology, that there are certain specific things in the historical technology tree and antecedents to that technology that would indicate that it had to have come from some connection to some wartime Nazi research project.
Wow. Well, and it makes all the sense in the world, because how could, if this was something to do with extraterrestrials, like you said earlier, I mean, they fly from somewhere else, even if they folded space or whatever that is,
right.
There's debris out there.
Right.
A pebble could hit one of these things and crash it.
Right, right.
So they said, that the metal or whatever this is that the thing was made out of was very thin, and being taken down with lightning.
Oh yeah, the whole thing. There, if we'll get into the debris, eventually in this Roswell series, because I want to go through it point by point.
Yes.
What was said about it and what you can actually uncover in the terrestrial technology tree.
Yes.
Okay, as early as 1932. Okay. So, I'm serving notice to those Roswell researchers, who say that certain types of these things were not known until 1965. Yeah. No, you're wrong. You didn't dig deep enough.
Yeah.
Because there were certain properties that were known as early as 1932.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, wow. Yeah, it is. Wow. But you see, the other thing, the problem that I think really that the ET crowd that has been interpreting Roswell has had, and here I believe that Carl Flock was dead on, the late Carl Flock, is he called it the will to believe. Oh. And I begin the whole book by pointing out that Roswell has almost the status of an article in the extraterrestrial religion and its creed.
Yes.
So that you cannot be someone like me and come along and say, okay, it's not a balloon and it's not ET.
Yeah.
Because, I guarantee you that community will view me, regardless of whether they're ET believer or skeptic, they will look at me as being the real wacko. Okay? But all I'm saying is, if you stop and analyze what I'm saying it's extraordinary and it's terrestrial.
Yes.
And that's really not all that wacko. The real wacko is the one who has left over all of this chain of analysis and evidence and come to the conclusion that it had to be extraterrestrial. No, that's simply not so. And to show that case, that's why this book is so long. Yeah. I've had to show and quote them extensively, get them on record, and then go back over and point out the tendentiousness in the arguments, the leaps of logic, the ignoring of certain classes of evidence.
Right.
On both parts, on the skeptic's part as well as the ET believer's part. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the inductive case that I've made is fairly strong. And I have to
Yes.
This is really unfair of me, but I have to share a little secret that I put in the book. And it's not...
Boy, people better grab their pen and paper and write this down.
Well, I put the secret in the book, but I'm not going to let out the details here.
Okay.
You remember our good friend Dr. Curt Davis?
Yeah.
The fellow that was the Nazi paperclip scientist that ended up as the senior flight administrator during Apollo at Cape Canaveral?
Yes.
Good friend of Dr. Werner von Braun?
Yeah.
Remember him? Remember how he wasn't even a rocket scientist at all?
Yeah.
Remember how he was nothing but a high-voltage electrical engineer?
Oh, boy.
Oh. Well? What I found, GeorgeAnn, as I was researching this book absolutely floored me.
Oh, I'll bet.
Mm-hmm.
The comment you just made is extremely interesting.
Well,
yes.
I'll go a little further. I'll let a little secret out of the bag. That among many of the other things that these paperclip Nazis that we have in New Mexico are doing, amongst which activities include spying on us.
Yes, and
for
they have a base there, too.
Oh, yeah. Now the Luftwaffe has a base there.
Isn't that nice?
Isn't that nice?
Oh.
Yeah, we don't have air in Germany. We have to come over here and learn how to fly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. But anyway, post-war Germany has managed to do what Hermann Goering, and only in his wildest dreams could have imagined doing, and that's having a Luftwaffe base in the United States.
Oh, that was an orgasmic moment when they.
I'm sure it was. I'm sure that. He was in his grave.
Oh, gee. Oh. Yes.
But anyway, this Dr. Davis was at Fort Bliss in El Paso during the Roswell incident, okay? Now, I'm asking your listeners to remember what I said in the Cosmic War and what was said in those Magic 12 documents that I looked at, simply on the basis of what they said in the internal evidence. Well, if you read them, they say that they brought in a bunch of these paperclip Nazis to look at this stuff because they thought it looked kind of familiar, to quote Colonel Corso again.
Yes.
Okay.
Little familiar, yeah.
Yeah, a little familiar. And these German scientists say, well, it looks to us that this is some sort of neutronic engine relying on thermonuclear fusion, and you've got, and they go on in this vein.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, okay, Werner von Braun is a rocket scientist.
Yeah.
Hermann Oberth is a rocket scientist. Mm-hmm. Arthur Rudolph is a rocket scientist. Ernst Steinhoff is a rocket scientist. Okay? None of these guys are really going to be the people you'd bring in to look at anything like this.
Right.
Okay?
Yes.
But you would bring a Dr. Curt Davis.
Oh, yes.
Okay? Now, what I found very interesting is that a year later, after Roswell, beginning about that time, in fact, of the Roswell incident, American counterintelligence, for some reason, began a re-examination. Isn't this interesting? A re-examination of most of the security clearances for those paperclip scientists. And at the top of the list was Dr. Davis.
Oh.
Isn't that interesting?
Boy, that is.
That's not coincidental.
No.
But now here's the final little secret that I found. And you're going to love this. I'm not going to say what the evidence is. But you remember our friend Dr. Richter down in Argentina?
Oh, yes, dear Argentina.
Good. Yeah, don't cry for me, Argentina.
Right.
Well, I discovered something very interesting in reading Dr. Davis' paperclip file. In fact, I reproduced some of this documentation in Roswell and the Reich.
Yeah.
I discovered that Davis worked for the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, which we already knew. But he worked on a project measuring high voltage discharges in a plasma circa 1942 and 1943.
Oh, my.
At the same time that Dr. Ronald Richter was working for the AEG company on precisely the same kind of project.
Oh, my.
Oh, my, indeed.
That's breathtaking.
This means, I think, that the case is fairly strong. That you have one Nazi Bell scientist in Argentina who was a close colleague with another Nazi Bell scientist in New Mexico.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, Joseph.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Oh, my goodness.
And what is their key preoccupation? Plasma. And what are we doing with that plasma? Well, we're rotating it, and we're pulsing it with high voltage electricity.
Oh, my.
And what's lightning?
Yes.
High voltage direct current electricity.
Yes.
And if you have a propulsion system that relies on rotating pulsed plasma and all of a sudden you're struck with lightning, that, could probably throw things out of kilter a bit. So, there's another little data point for you folks to consider.
That's just like, wow.
Uh-huh.
Oh, Joseph.
Yeah, that was a big wow moment for me, too.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Oh, wow.
So, it's, I think this book is going to be a little shocker for a lot of people. I really do think that I have been able to outline a fairly solid inductive case. I don't think that I'll manage to persuade the big names in Roswell ufology that have been heavily invested with the ET interpretation.
Yeah.
And by the same token, I don't think that I'll manage to persuade any of the big name skeptics either.
Right. Well, people can believe what they want to, even if it isn't true.
And I want to say something. I want to say something about that. I'm not saying that these investigators and these other researchers are dishonest. They are not. Because, in fact, I'm reliant upon their research to make my own case.
Yes.
So I'm not trying to say that these are dishonest people. I'm just saying, okay, they've got their biases and I've got mine, and let's look at this part of the case and see if it makes any sense.
Yes.
Okay? So I'm tossing it out there, really, to have people sit down and be a little bit more level-headed.
Yeah.
And not to dismiss this Nazi angle too quickly. I think it's been given too short shrift in at least this one incident. I'm not saying certainly that all UFOs are Nazis,
Right.
And if I were, then you could tag me off to the nut bin,
Well, these are the people that don't have addresses and telephone numbers.
Well, this is also true.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's kind of the overview of the book, and we'll get into the point-by-point, blow-by-blow account.
This is awesome material. And I've got to ask you just, because one of my favorite things are the templates.
Yes.
Now, how does that play into this?
Well, again, the key goes back to this idea of rotating pulse plasma. That's your template.
Okay.
Because that plasma, remember what the sun itself is. What is it? It's a big, huge. It's a big, huge rotating ball of plasma, and the rotation is all differential. In other words, it's taking place at different speeds of rotation.
Yeah. And
it's not giving off the amounts of energy, types of energy. If the purely thermonuclear model of stellar energy production was true, that's where all of this torsion physics and Nikolai Kozyrev and, all that stuff I talked about in the Philosopher's Stone comes in.
Right.
So again, we're back to square one. It's all the same physics. It's all the same physics. And, I've said over and over again that the Nazis were investigating this technology with the Bell to do three things with it. It was a gateway technology, folks. It was not itself a UFO. It was not itself a Nazi flying saucer, because you certainly wouldn't want to be inside the thing trying to fly it around, because it'd kill you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you say gateway, amplify on that a little.
Well, I was going to. It was a gateway technology that they were trying to explore the possibilities of this kind of torsion-based physics to get, number one, free energy for energy independence for Germany. Mm-hmm. Number two, to have a field propulsion, in other words, a legitimate, if you will, flying saucer that could manipulate space-time and gravity and do all sorts of neat, fun things.
Yeah.
And the final thing, of course, that they wanted this technology for was a doomsday weapon, because if you can play with the fabric of space-time directly,
yes,
then what it means is that if you weaponize that, you have the potential of making a weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker.
Oh my!
Yeah, it's not something to sneeze at. It's not something to think is a small thing in any way. And in fact, if you go back to the classification of the Nazi Bell inside of Nazi Germany, it was classified what? War decisive.
Wow.
And it was the only one that was classified that way.
Oh. Well, that makes nuclear weapons antiques.
Oh, yes.
It just does, and our whole grid system, all of that is just antique.
Yeah.
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 Oh. What do you think the chances are that mankind in general are going to benefit from some of these technologies, Joseph?
Well, I think, GeorgeAnn, ultimately we have to, because this story and aspects of it, regardless of which aspect you follow, this alternative physics is now leaking all over the place.
Yeah.
It's no longer possible to put the genie back into the bottle. The elite now, I think, the real problem for them is how do we keep this technology, how do we use this technology for human benefit without allowing it to proliferate and be weaponized?
Yes.
I think this is their overriding concern right now. It has to be. I do think, and you know for the reasons why, that we had this discussion privately.
Yes.
I do think that this technology has been weaponized and that someone has been using it.
Oh, yes, and I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think this is another reason that at least the Anglo-American elite is so panicked.
Yeah.
Because this technology is being used and clearly demonstrated against them, and there are certainly clear messages being sent to the elite power centers of other places in the world as well.
Yes.
As to who is sending that message, my own opinion is, of course, that it is probably some descendant of this Nazi international.
Boy, we're back to the people with no addresses and no phone numbers.
Exactly.
Terrestrial, but oh my goodness, it just, this story, Joseph, is so huge.
Oh, it is. Yes.
It's the story of the millennia.
Yeah, it really is.
Oh,
it really
my
is.
goodness.
It is.
Oh.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said millennia plural. I think, it's coming to a head very quickly.
Well, I think we see every day people, and I don't, I'm kind of following along with a friend of yours that believes this, and I do too. I agree. Bad people are getting worse, and good people are getting better.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do too. I do too.
Yes.
And I think that's probably the aspect of this physics that's going to come unstuck next, is the connection between consciousness and this physics.
Well,
and there's direct connection.
Yeah, and the consciousness has a great deal to do with the templates.
Yes.
Oh,
absolutely it does.
And it's funny. It's like a computer. You put your hand on that mouse or planchette, and you're angry or upset. Mm-hmm. Your computer doesn't work very well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that these templates that we've talked about, and I'm not trying to belabor the subject, but if consciousness is not local, and people maintain a good equilibrium in their thinking, we win.
Yes.
Yes. The good people win in the end. So it's very important for people not to... Well, Joseph, we've talked about this too. Everything is about dividing people. You're a Democrat or a Republican. You hate black people, or you hate Mexicans, or you hate this, or they keep people divided.
Yes, yes.
And this technology, I may be wrong, but it can intensify the templates somehow.
Oh, yes, absolutely it can.
See, so if we load up a template with a bunch of nonsense and negativity and they intensify it, oh boy, we have hell to pay.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Oh,
it is truly powerful stuff. There's no getting around it. And, it's the connection between consciousness and this physics is straight out of quantum mechanics. I mean, you don't have to go any further than the uncertainty principle to see it.
Yeah.
And, and there have been reams of treatises written by physicists and philosophers ever since.
Wow. About
the uncertainty principle and precisely this point. So it's very true. It's very, very true.
Well, and it's also a little scary.
It's a lot scary.
Yeah, because the responsibility is on us.
Well, it's scary not only because of that, but it's scary because, a bunch of swastika-wearing, goose-stepping, swaggering, genocidal maniacs kept their hands on this stuff after World War II and kept playing with it.
Yeah.
That's the real story here.
Oh.
And, it's very apparent to me that by the mid-1950s, the United States Air Force, when it's secretly interviewing this Richter character down in Argentina, it's very apparent to me that it realizes by that time it's got a really severe problem.
Yeah.
If it's not bad enough that you have Nazis crossing in New Mexico, but you also have this guy down in Argentina doing, Lord knows what.
Yes. Oh, my goodness.
And it's very clear if you examine the track record that Juan Perón is not in charge of this thing.
In name only.
In name only.
Oh,
a certain Martin Bormann was the co-signer on the checking account. So
Oh my gosh.
It's kind of rather obvious that we've got a major problem here.
Yes, we do.
So and when you see the evidence of this problem unfold in Roswell and the Reich, the details of it will really, truly astound you when we get into the, in future talks, when we get into the details that are in the documents themselves.
Right.
Because it is very clear that as early as 1947, the Air Force, at least it is to me, that the Air Force strongly suspects is dealing with something independent and Nazi. And that by 1955, at the end of its interviews with Richter, it knows it is.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think this is the same attitude, that the Tower of Babel people were.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. That book is coming out in a couple months, so.
Yes.
I'm preparing to get body slammed, I think.
Oh, no. You are greatly appreciated by those of us that can think out of the box. And, Joseph, you are a real blessing to a lot of people all over this planet. And I want to say hello to Australia and Russia and Argentina and Chile.
And Chile.
Yeah, and everywhere on this planet. You have listeners, Joseph, and your work is very valuable, extremely valuable. So, everybody, you can contact Adventures Unlimited Press and get a copy. Be sure you get this first edition, Roswell and the Reich, the Nazi Connection. And Adventures Unlimited is, let me see, I've got it here.
1-800.
Yeah.
718.
Right.
4514, and please, folks, during normal business hours in the Central Time Zone. It's if you call after hours right now, you're just going to get a recording, or you're going to make Jerry awfully mad.
Yeah, dear Jerry.
We don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So during normal business hours, or you can go to Amazon and get it there.
1-800-718-4514. And again, as Joseph Farrell said, that is in the Central Time Zone in the United States. That number will get you Adventures Unlimited Press. get a copy of this wonderful book. Oh my goodness. Joseph, this is historic. This book is just...
Well, I don't know if it's going to be historic or not. I do think that it's going to be impossible after it's out to ignore the Nazi angle, as has been done previously.
Right. Yeah, they've operated very stealth.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Very, very fascinating and well-researched.
I hope so.
Oh, you hope so. Oh, my goodness, I know your work, and you put your heart and soul into the details. And it's, a little thing to the readers out there and the listeners. Believe me, Joseph puts a lot of dots in those details, so don't just gloss over them. You'll find a lot of things